Here we're going to talk about one of the more important methods for factoring. What do we do in cases where our leading coefficient isn't 1? So what if it doesn't just start with x squared or y squared or a squared or b squared? It's got a number out front. So in this one we see 3y squared as our first term. Why does this make this more difficult? Well, previously we've been kind of guessing and checking on our two last numbers. What adds to this, what multiplies to this, etc. But when you get a front number out here, now, especially if the front number is not prime, this one is, but it can be worse. If the front numbers say like 20, you have no idea how to split up the front two terms. It could be 4 and 5, it could be 10 and 2. It makes guessing and checking, it's still possible, but it makes guessing and checking take a lot longer. So this three-step method, called the AC method, or sometimes referred to as the AC method, will shorten it up significantly. So step one is we want to find factors of AC. So when they're talking about AC, what they mean is they're giving these things in quadratic form. They're giving the coefficients nicknames. They're in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. So a is the first coefficient, b is the middle number, and c is the last number. Just so they can talk about them more easily. So if I want to find factors of a times c that add to b, in this problem, a times c, and be careful the signs matter. So that's something I'll do off on the side. I'll just jot over on a piece of scrap paper or off on the edge of my paper, what is a times c? Well, in this problem, a times c is -6. 3 times -2. And I like to write down b also. b is 5. So I know what my goal is. So I'm trying to find two factors, two things that multiply to -6 that add to 5. So at first 2 and 3 jump out at me, but be careful, one of them has to be negative to multiply to a -6, and that would add to -1, so that's not quite what we want. Maybe -6 and 1. That's close, it adds to -5. So what if we just change the signs? 6 and -1, they still multiply to -6, but they still add to 5. So we found our two factors. So step 2. What do I do once I find those two factors? Well, those two numbers are the correct way to split up the middle term. So you want to rewrite your problem. Careful, we're not changing anything. We're just kind of unsimplifying it. Instead of writing 5, we're writing plus 6y minus 1y. Notice if we got like terms together, that's still the same as 5y. So we didn't change our problem, we just rewrote it. So step number 3 is factor by grouping. Notice when we split it up, we end up with two groups of 2. Here's 2 terms, and here's 2 terms. So let's see what we can factor out of these. So 3y squared and 6y, I can factor a 3 out, and they both have a y. And I'd be left with y plus 2. I'll check on that, multiplying. That multiplies to that, and 3 times 2 gives me 6y. Alright, on these two, they don't have a lot in common, but notice how they're both negative. So at the very least, I'd probably like to factor out a -1. And so -1 times y is -1y, and -1 times positive 2 is -2. So all set up. Here's the moment where we know we did the problem right. Notice how this factor and this factor match, which means in and of itself, this factor and this factor are a common factor if I step back and look at the whole problem as 1. So if I look at the whole problem as 1, I can see, all right, y plus 2 is a factor. And what am I left with if I factor out y plus 2? I have a 3y and a -1, so 3y minus 1 is my other factor. Now, since factoring is kind of the opposite of foiling, especially in these because they take more steps, I would always step back and just FOIL it really quick, even if it's only in your head, to make sure it actually works. So 3y times y is 3y squared. 3y times, for my first term, 3y times 2 is 6y. And my outside term is -1 times y. So 6y and -1 is where we got the 5 from. And notice 6 and -1, those two magic numbers, they were actually our inside-outside terms. And then my last term, 2 times -1 is -2. So we can FOIL to check and make sure that it actually works. All right, now that we know the method, let's try one more. I'll put the original problem up top. So 7y squared minus 23y plus 6. So in this one, A times C is 7 times 6, both positive, so 42. And B is negative 23. So let's start jotting down any factors we can think of for 42. 7 and 6 are the two where I just got that from. And notice in this, they both need to be negative because I have to multiply to a positive, but how can I get them to add to a negative if I don't have two negative numbers? So that adds to negative 13, so that's not going to work. 42 is an even number, so I could try 2. So half of 42, 2 and 21, but remember, I have to make them both negative if I have any chance of adding to a negative number. So multiply to positive 42, and those two do look like they add to negative 23. So we found our two factors. What do I do once I found my two factors? We're going to split up the middle term. So 7y squared minus 2y minus 21y plus 6. So same exact problem. I just put minus 2 minus 21 instead of minus 23 because it's the same thing. Another thing is, it doesn't matter what order you put them in. You could do minus 21 minus 2. If you have the two right factors, you just split up the middle term. It doesn't matter what order, it'll still work. All right, so step 3, now we're going to factor by grouping. So what can we factor out of those two? What can we factor out of those two? 7 and 2 don't have any common factors, so it looks like I can just pull out a y, and I'm left with 7y minus 2. Y squared, 2 times y is negative 2y. All right, then here, 21 and 6, I can factor 3 out of both of them. And I'm left with 3 times negative 7 gives you negative 21, and 3 times 2 gives you 6. Now I did this on purpose to point something out. See how these don't quite match? And so the more of these you'll do, you might notice it beforehand, but even if you don't, pull out the 3, it almost matches except for the sign. Well, let's go back in time and say, what if we pulled out negative 3? So don't be afraid to try things, you can always fix that after. Negative 3 times positive 7 now gives us negative 21, and negative 3 times negative 2 gives us positive 6. Now it looks like they match. And so one of my factors is 7y minus 2, because I can see it here and here. And what am I left with when I factor that out? A y minus 3. So there's AC method factor.